Hi, today I'm going to talk about cognitive load theory or cognitive overload, which is a new theory on learning about how the sort of intrinsic or even extraneous difficulty of a learning task impacts our ability to learn, to remember, to retrieve information, and so forth. And I want to give you my perspective on this because I think it's quite interesting and it kind of touches on something that I've talked about before. In its essence, I feel that cognitive load theory is about how do you make the task easier, essentially. And the way you make a learning task easier as it applies to languages is to activate prior knowledge. In other words, if you can learn something that you kind of, in a way, already know, it's going to be easier to learn that. And if it's easier, you're going to be happier and more satisfied with the learning process, and you'll probably stay with the task. I've often said that language learning is a sort of a reiterative or an iterative process. You learn it once, you forget, you go back again. I've used the metaphor of my lawnmower, where if the grass of my lawn is very high, I will actually set the blades a little higher, an inch or so higher, so that my first pass through the grass will be easier, and then my second pass will also be easier, and I'll have the same grass, but I'll have walked through the lawn twice with a little effort as opposed to pushing against much more resistance. Another example I used is cross-country skiing. If it's snowing and you're going through tracks that have already been made by a skier ahead of you, even if more snow has fallen on these tracks, you're now gliding more easily. It's more comfortable. You're moving faster. And so you're also taking advantage of, in a way, prior work or prior knowledge. Again, I think a lot of these education experts have a tendency to overcomplicate things. So they talk about the effect of cognitive overload on your short-term memory or working memory and retrieving. And those are a lot of details that I don't fully understand, but I can use my brain without knowing these things. If I have a learning system and process that works, I don't need to know in great detail how that all functions in my brain. I don't need to know how my car works in order to drive my car. So one of the things that I have found is that prior knowledge, in other words, my previous exposure to a language, however imperfectly I remember that, however many gaps there are, it's all good. So if I, for example, am listening to a podcast in Persian and there's lots there that I don't understand, and I'm really only picking up certain chunks of words and phrases that I'm quite comfortable, that almost naturally understand, but I can't tie them all together to really understand the whole podcast, that is still good exposure. So that creates a sort of prior knowledge. Then when I go to link and I start clicking on these words to see what they mean, then I already have that first pass through, that first pass with a lawnmower that makes the second pass easier. It still doesn't guarantee that the next time I listen to it, I'm going to understand it all. It's all a gradual build-up through this iterative and reiterative and going back again process, which I think is the way to reduce the cognitive burden. Another sort of extraneous factor in cognitive overload is how enjoyable the task is. So if I am listening to something that's too difficult, that's not enjoyable. But on the other hand, if I'm listening to something that is of no interest to me, that's also not enjoyable. So as I've said before, if I'm dealing with content that is intrinsically interesting to me, that lessens the extraneous burden of fighting to try to learn the language, deliberately try to learn the language from content that's of no interest, or a voice that I don't like, or a screechy, scratchy audio recording. In other words, everything that makes the task more enjoyable reduces the extraneous cognitive burden. Now, along the same lines, we all have different tastes in what we like to do. I'm not a fan of sort of deliberate retrieval exercises, drills, flashcards, you name it. That's not to say that people who like doing those things aren't going to benefit from them. It's a matter of what people enjoy doing. If you enjoy doing it, then the extraneous sort of cognitive burden is lessened. So in my own case, I like listening and reading, and there is ample evidence that reading is in fact a form of retrieval exercise. In fact, it is retrieving words and phrases, or in the case of listening, sounds, from a meaningful context, which, according to some research, is more effective than trying to retrieve things in isolation. So where I'm coming from in this discussion of cognitive load is that it still comes down to the basic issue of trying to keep things simple and enjoyable. How do we encourage the learner to stay on task? How do we increase the likelihood that the learner will enjoy the process, the learning process? And in that sense, the emphasis should be the perspective of the learner rather than how teachers or educators can structure activities in the classroom or design textbooks or things of that nature, which introduce a level of complexity which may in fact not contribute to lessening the cognitive load. Cognitive load will be lessened if the task is simpler, more straightforward, and more enjoyable. So as a layman, that's my reaction to this whole issue of the cognitive burden. Thank you for listening.